Welcome to Last Moments, I'm Tucker. Today we're diving into some of the worst Karen deaths ever recorded. And having gone through all of these cases, believe me, it's far more possible than it seems. From a Karen wielding pepper spray to defend her unleashed dog, to a Karen stepping past avalanche barriers for that perfect mountain selfie, tasting nature's indifference in the dumbest way ever. It was October 4th, 2015. The afternoon sun beat down on an elementary school's parking lot in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where colorful booths and inflatable structures dotted the asphalt for the annual fall fair. Among the families navigating the carnival games stood Denise Calder, a 36-year-old part-time bookkeeper whose presence would turn an ordinary school fundraiser into a scene of unforgettable tragedy. Denise had worked sporadically for various small businesses around Albuquerque, never holding a position for too long. Co-workers described her as competent with numbers but volatile under pressure, prone to outbursts over minor workplace conflicts. She had been fired twice for confrontations with management. Her 8-year-old son Tyler was her primary focus, and she attended his school events religiously, often volunteering with an intensity that made other parents uncomfortable. The school fair featured typical attractions including ring toss booths, face painting stations, and several large inflatable structures powered by industrial fans. These inflatables, standing between 10 and 15 feet tall, were kept inflated by weighted metal fan units that maintained constant air pressure. Each fan base weighed approximately 60 pounds and was fitted with a heavy-gauge steel housing around the motor. Manufacturer guidance and event protocols required additional anchoring or sandbag weights on asphalt surfaces. But that day, organizers relied only on the weight of the base. Tyler had been playing a ring toss game at a booth run by parent volunteers, attempting to land plastic rings on glass bottles for prizes. After multiple failed attempts and $5 spent, he walked away empty-handed and visibly upset. Denise approached the booth demanding another chance, her voice rising as she accused the volunteers of rigging the game. When they politely refused, explaining the rules applied equally to everyone, her agitation escalated. Rather than walking away, Denise pivoted toward the nearest inflatable structure, a 12-foot giraffe-shaped bounce house positioned adjacent to the game booth. Several children were playing inside as she reached the inflatable and grabbed the vinyl material with both hands. Witnesses reported she appeared to be attempting to forcefully pull it down or tip it over. The structure's tethered connection to its fan base created resistance, but Denise continued jerking the inflatable violently back and forth. The weighted fan base, sitting unsecured on the asphalt and lacking the recommended sandbag weights, began rocking with each pull. On Denise's fourth or fifth violent shake, the 60-pound metal unit tipped forward completely. The steel housing pivoted and struck her left temple with concentrated force as she leaned into another pull. She dropped instantly, her body crumpling onto the hot asphalt. Witnesses reported no movement from Denise after she fell. Children who had been playing inside the inflatable were pulled away by parents, many screaming. A volunteer called 911, and emergency medical services found Denise unresponsive with visible trauma to her head. Despite immediate intervention, she was pronounced dead at the scene minutes later. The medical examiner confirmed a depressed skull fracture with brain herniation, consistent with catastrophic blunt force trauma. The manner of death was ruled accidental, with investigators noting that the fatal injury occurred during her deliberate attempt to overturn the inflatable structure. The funeral was sparsely attended, with Tyler placed temporarily with Denise's sister in Las Cruces before entering long-term foster care. The elementary school removed all large inflatable structures from subsequent fairs, implemented a permanent ban on fan-powered attractions, and opened an internal safety review with the district insurer.
It was May 19th, 2018. The Overtoom bike lane in Amsterdam stretched wide and busy under overcast skies, a main artery where thousands of cyclists commuted daily through one of Europe's most bike-dependent cities. Brigitte van der Berg, a 52-year-old administrative assistant at a local municipal office, walked in the center of the lane with her terrier on a long, retractable leash, trailing across the pavement, blocking traffic during the evening rush. Brigitte had worked in Amsterdam for 3 decades, but had never adapted to the city's cycling culture. Colleagues described her as stubborn and confrontational, someone who took minor inconveniences personally. She owned no bicycle herself, preferring to walk her dog Max through whatever route seemed convenient, regardless of designated bike infrastructure. Friends had warned her repeatedly about wandering into bike lanes, but she always disregarded their concerns. Amsterdam's bike lanes operate like highways, with cyclists traveling at speeds between 15 and 25 miles per hour in dedicated infrastructure, separated from pedestrian walkways by clear markings and physical barriers. The Overtoom lane was particularly fast-moving, serving as a commuter route where cargo bikes hauling children and goods mixed with racing cyclists and electric bikes. Pedestrians entering these lanes face serious injury risk, a fact reinforced by city safety campaigns Brigitte had seen but ignored. That evening, Brigitte walked Max directly into the bike lane despite pedestrian crossings located every 50 yards. Multiple cyclists rang their bells frantically as she meandered along, looking at her phone while her dog sniffed the pavement. Traffic backed up behind her, a dozen riders forced to slow from 20 miles per hour to a crawl. A delivery cyclist shouted at her to move. Brigitte stopped completely, turning to yell back that she had every right to be there. The delivery rider swerved around her, clipping another cyclist and crashing onto the pavement. His groceries scattered across the lane. Instead of stepping aside, Brigitte began shouting louder about reckless cyclists, completely oblivious to the cargo bike approaching from behind at a distance too short for the rider to safely stop, approximately 25 feet away. The cargo bike's operator, transporting two children in the front box, rang his bell repeatedly while braking hard. Brigitte remained planted in place, gesturing angrily at the crashed delivery cyclist. The cargo bike, weighing approximately 200 pounds loaded with its riders and cargo, struck Brigitte from behind at approximately 20 miles per hour, the impact lifting her off her feet. Her body flew forward feet before her head struck the top of a waist-high Amsterdammertje, a narrow, unpadded steel bollard lining the lane's edge. The hollow metallic clang echoed through the street as Brigitte crumpled to the ground. The leash released from her hand as it slipped free under tension while bystanders screamed. The cargo bike operator fell sideways, protecting his children, who were shaken but uninjured. A pedestrian called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, finding Brigitte unconscious with visible head trauma and labored breathing. She died en route to the hospital, despite resuscitation attempts. The autopsy revealed massive cranial fractures, thoracic trauma, 6 broken ribs, and severe internal hemorrhaging. The medical examiner confirmed the steel bollard impact as the primary cause of death, with blunt force trauma from the initial bike collision contributing. Amsterdam authorities used the incident to reinforce pedestrian safety regulations in bike lanes, installing additional warning signs along the Overtoom route. Investigators noted that nearby municipal CCTV and a cyclist helmet camera had captured the sequence of events, helping reconstruct the collision. Brigitte's terrier Max was rescued at the scene after being quickly retrieved by a bystander during the chaos, and later adopted by her neighbor, who had repeatedly warned her about the bike lanes she refused to respect.
It was June 7, 2014, in Portland, Oregon. The Saturday farmers market stretched across several downtown blocks, drawing steady mid-morning crowds between 8 and 2. Brenda Holloway, 36, was a Portland real estate agent known among colleagues for being assertive and meticulous in negotiations. Friends later described her as persistent in conflicts once she believed she had been treated unfairly. A week earlier, she had purchased a jar of raw honey from the beekeeper and became convinced it had been diluted. She called him twice, demanding an explanation. He told her raw honey can crystallize or vary in texture depending on temperature and floral source. Brenda felt dismissed. That morning, she decided to confront him publicly and demand a refund and apology in person. She arrived around 10:15 a.m. and approached the booth immediately, raising her voice before the beekeeper could finish greeting her. Nearby customers turned as she loudly accused him of selling inferior products and misleading buyers. The beekeeper responded calmly, again offering a refund. Brenda refused to lower her voice and insisted she would not accept being dismissed as a customer. She demanded an apology and threatened to report him to market organizers. The beekeeper's display included 2 tables of products and positioned several feet behind the main customer area, a sealed observation hive used for demonstrations. The hive was enclosed in a wooden frame with clear panels, ventilated through screened sections, and secured with screws and 2 exterior latches. A printed sign at eye level read, "Do not touch, live bees." The unit sat on a small wheeled cart with locked wheels. As the exchange intensified, the beekeeper stepped back behind his table to create distance. Brenda followed, saying she had every right to stand wherever she wanted since she had paid for his product. In doing so, she crossed the customer boundary and backed into the cart holding the observation hive. The impact shifted the cart. One wheel rolled slightly off the uneven pavement edge, causing the hive to tilt and strike the ground on one corner. The fall split the wooden corner joint, snapping one latch and creating a visible opening along the panel edge. The vibration agitated the bees inside. Within seconds, several guard bees exited through the opening. Brenda, standing closest to the hive, was stung on the neck and forearms. As she swatted and turned, more stings followed near her hairline and jaw. She stumbled backward, tripped over a folding chair, and fell. The beekeeper immediately covered the hive with a thick canvas cloth to reduce light and limit further escape, while bystanders moved away. Within a minute, Brenda showed signs of a severe allergic reaction. Paramedics later learned she had a documented bee sting allergy, but she was not carrying an epinephrine auto-injector that morning. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived within minutes, pushing through the crowded walkway. Brenda was struggling to breathe and showing signs of dangerously low blood pressure. Intramuscular epinephrine was administered, and she was transported to a nearby hospital. Shortly after arrival, she went into cardiac arrest due to delayed epinephrine. Despite resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead later that morning. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as anaphylaxis triggered by multiple bee stings. The market closed for the remainder of the day. No criminal charges were filed. In the following season, organizers updated spacing requirements and required physical barriers for vendors displaying live insects or animals. It was November 2nd, 2014. In Columbus, Ohio, the air was damp and cool after a light afternoon rain. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement along High Street. Evening commuters moved in steady lines as buses stopped and pulled away along the curb. Earlier that evening, Charmaine Bell, 56, boarded a northbound city bus after finishing a small paid workshop at a rented community room. She ran a modest social media page built around filming confrontations in public places. Her videos focused on catching strangers violating rules and pushing them into arguments on camera. The audience was small, but she posted often and treated each clip like proof she was in charge. Before that, she had spent nearly 20 years as an administrative assistant. 2 years earlier, she left the job and poured her energy into the page. Friends said she planned confrontations like meetings, notes on her phone, rehearsed lines, quick searches of local policies. She was taking a prescribed blood thinner after a clot the year before. The bus was crowded with commuters. Near the front, a man in his 20s sat in a clearly marked priority seat, reserved for seniors and riders with disabilities. Charmaine spotted the sign immediately. Passengers later said she raised her phone and started recording before speaking. She stepped into the aisle, pointed at the sign, and held the phone toward his face. Her voice carried, sharp and escalating, as she continued confronting him while recording as he tried to look away. The driver announced the next stop, East North Broadway, while the argument continued. Other riders watched without stepping in. Shortly after 8 p.m., the doors opened. The man stepped onto the wet sidewalk. Charmaine followed, still filming. Outside, he tried to keep walking toward the crosswalk. Charmaine moved in front of him and continued confronting him while filming. Witnesses described her blocking his path and refusing to let the exchange end. When he tried to step around her, she grabbed the strap of his backpack to stop him. The man reacted instinctively. He twisted his shoulder to pull free and stepped away. He did not hit her, but the sudden yank shifted her weight backward. Rainwater had collected along the curb in a shallow strip. A yellow folding caution sign stood nearby, but it covered only part of the slick area. Charmaine wore narrow 3.5-inch spike heels. As she stepped back, her right heel slid sideways on the damp concrete. Her left foot didn't catch. Witnesses later told police she seemed more focused on keeping her phone up than on her footing. She tipped straight backward. The back of her head struck the curb edge. Her phone skidded across the pavement and stopped near the gutter. For a moment, she rolled to her side and pushed herself up, brushing at her coat as if embarrassed. A dark patch began spreading through her hair. She swayed and tried to steady herself. A man at the stop asked if she was all right. She waved him off, took 2 unsteady steps, then her knees buckled. She collapsed again, this time unresponsive. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived about 9 minutes later and transported her to the hospital. Scans revealed a skull fracture and a large subdural hematoma. Blood thinners prevented normal clotting, allowing the bleeding to expand rapidly. Surgeons performed emergency surgery, but her condition worsened overnight, and she died the next morning. The coroner ruled the death accidental blunt head trauma. Police determined the man's movement was a reflex after she grabbed his backpack, and no charges were filed. Transit officials later reminded riders that disputes over priority seating should be reported to drivers rather than handled by passengers directly. It was September 14, 2018, at a private wildlife sanctuary in the Florida Panhandle, specializing in rehabilitated but non-domesticated large predators. The 40-acre facility housed rescued animals under controlled conditions, with safety protocols developed over more than a decade of operation. A guided tour would turn deadly when repeated safety warnings were dismissed and physical barriers were breached. Elaine Porter, 58, was a retired travel agent from Pensacola who had recently begun volunteering with animal welfare groups. Investigators later learned she had a history of ignoring safety guidance at animal facilities, including prior warnings for entering restricted areas. Staff records and tour guides noted repeated boundary violations and a tendency to approach enclosures too closely. The sanctuary offered guided educational tours on weekends, led by trained staff with experience in animal behavior and safety. Groups were limited to 12 participants and received mandatory safety briefings emphasizing strict distance rules. That afternoon's group included 8 adults and 4 children. The guide, a wildlife biologist, repeatedly stressed that rehabilitated animals remained wild and that barriers existed solely for visitor protection. During the tour of the large cat section, staff repeatedly instructed all guests to remain behind established barriers positioned 6 feet from enclosure fencing. The barriers consisted of wooden railings designed to maintain safe distances while allowing clear viewing of the animals. Warning signs posted every 10 feet reinforced the importance of staying behind designated lines. The tour guide reported that Elaine stepped past the barrier, despite multiple verbal warnings, and approached the enclosure housing the rehabilitated panther. Other tour participants called for Elaine to return to the safe area, as staff members immediately moved toward her position, instructing her to step back slowly. Witnesses reported that Elaine leaned past the safety barrier and reached through a supervised viewing opening in the double-fenced enclosure system. The opening was designed for educational observation only, positioned at shoulder height, and not intended for physical contact with the animals. Elaine had extended her arm through the opening despite clear warning signage. The panther, a 120-pound male with natural predatory instincts intact despite rehabilitation, reacted defensively to the unexpected contact and attacked through the barrier opening. The animal's bite caused immediate severe vascular damage before staff could safely separate the animal using long-handled tools and emergency procedures. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes and found Elaine with severe lacerations to her arm and shoulder area. Advanced trauma care was initiated, including hemorrhage control and airway management. She was transported by helicopter to a hospital in Pensacola, where trauma surgeons attempted emergency surgery. Elaine was pronounced dead during surgery following unsuccessful attempts to control massive blood loss. The coroner's report cited severe lacerations and exsanguination from bite wounds as the cause of death, with damage to major blood vessels preventing survival, despite rapid medical intervention. Authorities later stated that the facility's established safety protocols were in place and that staff actions were consistent with those procedures. It was August 9, 2016, at a coastal zoo in Monterey, California, on a busy summer afternoon when the walrus exhibit stayed packed with visitors leaning along the rail, holding up phones as the animal surfaced and sank in slow cycles, while posted rules about distance and barriers were visible every few yards, but routinely ignored. Laura Whitcomb was 42 and worked as a regional sales coordinator, a job that kept her traveling and constantly documenting trips and outings. People who knew her described her as forceful and argumentative, especially in public places, where she often challenged staff and treated posted rules as negotiable rather than fixed. She was visiting the zoo with a coworker and focused on getting a close selfie with the walrus, not a zoomed photo, and not one taken from behind the barrier. She followed travel pages that praised risky behavior and had no experience with large animals, yet regularly dismissed safety rules as exaggerated or designed mainly to reduce liability. The walrus enclosure used a low, inward-sloped concrete barrier that separated visitors from a deep saltwater pool. Multiple signs warned against leaning, climbing, or reaching over the edge, and staff presence was higher during feeding windows because the animals were more active. A keeper had just finished reminding people to step back when Laura stopped and began arguing. She accused staff of overreacting, pointed to other visitors near the rail, and claimed the walrus was trained and harmless. She raised her phone and started recording, saying the rules were only for appearance, and when the warning was repeated, she climbed onto the barrier ledge to frame herself with the animal in the background. The concrete surface was wet from splashback. Laura leaned forward, holding her phone down toward the water as the walrus surfaced nearby, while waving her free hand to get its attention. Her weight shifted past the balance point of the barrier. Staff shouted for her to move back, and several people stepped away. The walrus surged upward suddenly, forcing water over the edge. Witnesses saw its body rise and felt the splash as a flipper struck Laura's forearm, knocking her off balance. Her phone flew out of her hand, her upper body tipped forward, and she went over the barrier headfirst into the pool. The animal reacted immediately to the unexpected entry. In the churned water, it made contact again, gripping her upper arm and shoulder with its mouth and pulling her several feet away from the edge as it submerged. Laura surfaced briefly, gasping, but was dragged under again as the walrus rolled. Water entered her airway while her legs kicked unevenly and then slowed. Underwater, her head struck the sloped concrete wall, and bubbles rose in a short burst before thinning. The walrus released her and moved toward deeper water, as alarms sounded throughout the exhibit. Emergency services were called right away. Staff used poles and flotation devices, but could not enter the pool until the animal cleared the area, which took nearly 2 minutes. When Laura was pulled out, she was unresponsive, with pale blue skin and water draining from her mouth and nose. CPR began on the deck within moments. Paramedics arrived 8 minutes after the call and continued resuscitation while transporting her, but she never regained a pulse. The medical examiner listed drowning as the primary cause of death, with blunt force injuries to the head and shoulder from striking the enclosure wall as contributing factors, meaning she inhaled water after being pulled under and injured during the struggle. Security footage confirmed the argument. The climb, the fall, and the delay caused by the animal's movement, and the zoo later raised the barrier height and added fixed standoff rails. It was May 18, 2014. The suburban streets of Western Sydney were quiet under a moonless sky. Cara Minton, a 41-year-old self-employed pet groomer, stood at the edge of her neighbor's property line, studying the layout through the wooden fence. Cara ran a small grooming business from her garage, servicing local dogs and cats for modest fees. Neighbors described her as abrasive and territorial, particularly regarding animals. Her property bordered a residential wildlife rehabilitation facility operated under state licensing, where injured native animals received long-term care before potential release. Cara had openly complained to the local council multiple times about the presence of bats, claiming they attracted vermin and damaged property values. Her complaints were dismissed as the facility operated legally with proper permits. For 6 months, Cara illegally set cage traps and poisoned food along the fence, targeting cats that strayed during enrichment. After 3 cats vanished over 4 months, the operator installed infrared CCTV, which captured Cara entering the property twice to retrieve the traps she'd placed inside the boundary. On this particular night, Cara likely noticed one of the cameras repositioned to cover her side of the fence. Rather than cease her activities, she seemed to have decided to remove the device entirely. She waited until after midnight. The facility had posted visible biosecurity warnings about handling wildlife and the risks of Lissa virus transmission from bats, and staff were vaccinated and required to use protective gloves and barriers when handling flying foxes. But Cara had never read them. At approximately 1 in the morning, Cara climbed the fence using a stepladder. The CCTV unit recorded her dropping into the yard and moving toward the device mounted on a post. She miscalculated her path in the darkness, stumbling through a maintenance gate that had been left unsecured into an enclosed recovery area. This section housed non-releasable wildlife requiring permanent care, including a gray-headed flying fox with a damaged wing that had been undergoing rehabilitation for 8 months. The startled bat, confined to a large mesh enclosure that Kara had torn open while trying to steady herself, reacted defensively when its enclosure was breached. It bit her right hand twice before she could pull away. Video footage showed Kara clutching her hand and scrambling backward, while audio from a nearby residential CCTV system captured her screaming. She fled back over the fence. The facility operator discovered the intrusion at 6:30 in the morning and immediately reported it to police, providing the original recording media as evidence. Police visited Kara that afternoon. She admitted to trespassing but insisted she was fine, refusing advice to immediately wash the wounds thoroughly and seek hospital care for post-exposure vaccination. She said she cleaned the wounds herself with household antiseptic. Over the following 3 to 4 weeks, Kara likely developed progressive confusion, anxiety, and difficulty swallowing. By the 5th week, she experienced painful muscle spasms and paralysis. Her sister found her collapsed at home on June 16th and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived immediately, but Kara died in intensive care 2 days later, despite aggressive supportive treatment. The autopsy confirmed death from Australian bat lyssavirus infection, a fatal neurological disease transmitted through bat bites. The coroner's report noted that while incubation is often measured in months, it can be far shorter, and that immediate post-exposure prophylaxis would have prevented death. But Kara's refusal of medical care eliminated that possibility. The facility operator faced no charges. Kara's estate was fined for illegal wildlife interference and trespassing.
It was July 11th, 2018. The afternoon air along an active lava viewing area in Hawaii's lower Puna region carried the sharp smell of sulfur as molten lava moved through open channels. Carol Laxman, a 62-year-old retired real estate agent from Phoenix, Arizona, stood behind safety barriers with her expensive camera equipment, visibly frustrated that the cordoned area prevented her from getting closer shots of the active lava flow. Carol had built a modest following on social media, documenting her travels after selling her real estate business 2 years prior. Her online persona centered on capturing dramatic landscape photography, often featuring herself posed near natural wonders. Friends described her as stubborn and entitled, someone who believed rules applied to others but not to her. She had traveled to Hawaii specifically to photograph the active volcanic flows, booking a guided tour with a commercial photography company that operated viewing platforms near the lava fields. Active lava flows present extreme hazards beyond the obvious molten rock. The ground surrounding flows consists of newly formed crust that can be dangerously thin, concealing underground lava tubes where superheated gases and molten rock flow beneath seemingly solid surfaces. Temperatures near active flows exceed 1,800 to 2,200 degrees, hot enough to ignite clothing and cause instant tissue damage. That afternoon, park rangers had posted multiple warning signs around the designated viewing area. Recent volcanic activity had created unstable ground conditions, and visitors were repeatedly instructed to remain behind safety barriers. Carol had already been warned twice by rangers after ducking under ropes to get closer shots. Other photographers in the area, including a professional crew filming for a documentary series, noticed her increasingly reckless behavior. Around 3:45 in the afternoon, Carol deliberately crossed the final safety barrier, climbing over warning signs that explicitly stated the danger of ground collapse. Several tourists shouted warnings as she approached the edge of an active lava flow. A park ranger stationed about 75 yards away began moving toward her position, calling out over a loudspeaker for her to return immediately. Carol waved dismissively and continued positioning herself on what appeared to be solid rock, overlooking a glowing lava channel. She was attempting to set up a timed photo with the flowing lava behind her. The thin crust beneath her feet gave no warning. She stepped onto a thin skylight, a fragile crust over an active lava tube, which collapsed beneath her, dropping her onto a superheated lava channel below. The The documentary crew's cameras captured the moment of collapse. Witnesses heard her screaming for approximately 4 seconds before the sound stopped. The park ranger immediately radioed for emergency services, but the location and extreme temperatures made any rescue attempt impossible. A specialized volcanic response team arrived within 20 minutes, but could only establish a safety perimeter. 2 days later, after volcanic activity subsided, recovery teams located charred skeletal fragments at the flow's edge. The coroner's report confirmed death resulted from catastrophic thermal burns covering over 90% of her body, inhalation of superheated gases that destroyed her respiratory system, and thermal shock. The coroner determined she died within seconds from catastrophic thermal burns and inhalation of superheated gases. The documentary footage was turned over to authorities and never publicly released. Park officials temporarily closed the viewing area and installed additional barriers. Carol's social media accounts remained active for a few days, filled with comments from followers who never learned what happened during her final photo attempt, before being taken down at her family's request.
It was July 18, 2015 in Waukegan, Illinois. Conditions on Lake Michigan were beginning to shift, with steady winds building across the open water and whitecaps forming farther offshore. Deborah Pruitt was 39 years old and lived in Waukegan, where she worked as a property manager for a residential apartment company. Colleagues described her as confident handling disputes with tenants and vendors, often preferring direct confrontation when she believed rules were being applied unfairly. She owned a 19-foot fiberglass motorboat that she kept at a slip in Waukegan Harbor and frequently described herself as an experienced boater. That morning, Deborah arrived at the marina with her younger sister, Michelle, and a neighbor, planning an afternoon on the lake. A small craft advisory scheduled for noon warned of 22 miles per hour winds, gusts up to 35, and waves between 4 and 6 feet, posted through harbor alerts and NOAA weather radio. A marina staff member mentioned the advisory as Deborah prepared to untie the lines and suggested postponing the trip. Deborah responded sharply, insisting she had far more boating experience than the staff member. She claimed advisories were exaggerated to reduce liability and accused the marina of trying to discourage them from launching. When he suggested they wear life jackets, she dismissed the advice and untied the lines despite the warning. They launched at 11:45 and headed north from the harbor. As winds increased sooner than forecast, conditions worsened and the boat struggled to maintain course in the growing chop, pitching heavily but not taking on water. At approximately 12:30, they decided to turn back toward shore. During the turn, the boat was exposed broadside to larger wave sets. For several minutes, waves struck the vessel from the starboard side. A larger wave struck at an angle while the boat still carried a slight list from the maneuver. The combined force rolled the vessel, and it capsized. All three were thrown into the water, where temperatures measured about 61 degrees Fahrenheit. None were wearing life jackets, and Deborah struggled to stay afloat. Michelle and the neighbor attempted to support her near the overturned hull as waves continued breaking against the capsized boat. A passing recreational vessel spotted the capsized boat at approximately 12:40 and radioed the Coast Guard. The reporting vessel remained nearby and attempted recovery, but was only able to safely pull 2 of the occupants aboard due to the wave height and instability near the overturned hull. The Coast Guard launched from the station at Waukegan Harbor and arrived on scene within approximately 20 minutes of the distress call. Rescue personnel first recovered Michelle and the neighbor from the water, both conscious but showing signs of hypothermia. Deborah Pruitt was not immediately visible. After several minutes of searching the area around the overturned hull, responders located her submerged a short distance away. She was brought aboard unresponsive. CPR was initiated immediately. Deborah was transported to shore, where paramedics continued resuscitation efforts for over 30 minutes without response. She was pronounced dead at 2:11 in the afternoon. The coroner listed the cause of death as drowning, with hypothermia as a contributing factor. The Coast Guard cited the absence of life jackets and later coordinated a public awareness campaign with marine safety agencies. After the incident, local marine authorities reinforced life jacket compliance requirements for recreational boaters. Safety patrols increased random checks, and citations were issued to operators and passengers found underway without properly accessible Coast Guard-approved personal flotation devices. It was August 12, 2017. The Oklahoma heat lingered over the Tulsa fairgrounds as thousands packed in for the final night of a 3-day rock festival. By dusk, side entrances were locked and perimeter patrols tightened. Security presence increased quietly along the outer walls. Standing near a restricted viewing lane was Brenda Harlow, 41. She ran a small lifestyle blog centered on upgrades, shortcuts, and getting closer to spaces most people were not allowed into. Her readership was modest but steady. During the week, she worked as a regional sales representative for a cosmetics distributor across Oklahoma and Arkansas. Online, she projected confidence and connections. In person, she had a habit of pushing hard when told no. Traffic to her blog had declined in recent months, and sponsorships slowed. She began treating live events as chances to capture angles other bloggers could not. She even printed imitation badges, believing confidence in appearance could bypass most security barriers. That evening, she arrived with a general admission ticket and a homemade badge clipped to her blouse. At the side stage checkpoint, security scanned it and rejected it immediately, explaining the platform was restricted to credentialed media. Brenda insisted they were mistaken and claimed she had already been cleared to film. She pointed toward the stage and argued her audience expected backstage coverage. When asked to step aside, she leaned past the barrier rope and demanded a supervisor, accusing the guard of preventing her from accessing the platform before finally walking away as nearby attendees watched. The elevated media platform remained restricted, and several signs along the perimeter wall warned visitors not to climb it. The only clear view outside the restricted area came from a 9-foot masonry wall separating the public walkway from an internal production lane. The wall was topped with narrow iron finials, spaced a few inches apart. Dust from heavy foot traffic coated the capstone. 2 security guards rotated through that section at regular intervals. Earlier that night, her phone contained a short clip showing the stage from ground level and her frustration about blocked views. At 9:16 p.m., according to perimeter timestamps, Brenda began climbing the wall, using mortar seams as footholds. A guard approaching from the walkway signaled for her to come down. Instead, she continued upward, pausing briefly near the top before pulling herself onto the capstone. By 9:18 p.m., she had swung one leg over the wall and was balancing between the iron finials when a pyrotechnic cue detonated from the stage, roughly 60 yards away. The blast echoed along the masonry as she turned toward the sound, and while shifting her weight backward, her right foot slid on loose dust covering the capstone, causing her to lose balance and fall. She fell onto the iron finials below. One pointed finial entered her lower abdomen above the right hip and stopped against the pelvic bone. The impact pitched her forward before gravity pulled her free. Witnesses heard a sharp metallic strike before she collapsed onto the concrete walkway, where blood quickly spread through her clothing. A nearby vendor called emergency services while security alerted on-site medics, who reached her within minutes and attempted to control the bleeding. Paramedics arrived at 9:24 p.m. and transported her as resuscitation efforts continued. At the hospital, surgeons determined the iron finial had severed the right iliac artery. Despite transfusions and emergency surgery, she went into cardiac arrest from blood loss and could not be revived. The death was ruled hemorrhagic shock caused by penetrating trauma. In the following months, festival organizers replaced the pointed finials along the wall with rounded caps and increased perimeter patrols to prevent similar incidents. It was June 18, 2016, on Interstate 5 outside Redding, California, during moderate afternoon traffic. Weather conditions were clear with temperatures in the mid-80s and posted speed limits of 70 miles per hour. The highway section featured gentle curves and good visibility, with light construction work causing occasional lane restrictions. An aggressive driving incident would end in a high-speed rollover when road rage spiraled completely out of control. Pamela Brooks, 44, worked as a regional sales representative for a medical equipment company, requiring extensive highway travel throughout Northern California. Co-workers described her to investigators as having aggressive driving habits and particular intolerance toward motorcyclists, often expressing frustration about their lane positioning. Pamela had a record of prior traffic violations tied to aggressive driving behavior. Investigators later confirmed that she had previously been cited for following too closely and making unsafe lane changes. Company records also showed repeated complaints from clients about late arrivals to appointments, often attributed to traffic delays. GPS data reviewed after the crash indicated a consistent pattern of speeding during business travel. That afternoon, Pamela was driving her company vehicle northbound toward a client meeting in Oregon. Traffic was moving at normal speeds, with occasional slowdowns due to construction zones. A motorcyclist traveling in the same direction was maintaining legal positioning in the right lane, following traffic laws regarding lane usage and speed limits. The rider, a 34-year-old construction worker commuting home from a job site, was wearing proper safety equipment and operating a properly registered motorcycle. A witness who was driving from another vehicle claimed Pamela's sedan approaching the motorcycle from behind at high speed, then beginning to tailgate at an unsafe distance. The footage captures her vehicle weaving between lanes while honking repeatedly and making gestures toward the motorcyclist. Other drivers began changing lanes to avoid the erratic behavior. Pamela accelerated past the motorcycle, then swerved back into the right lane and attempted to block the rider's forward progress by reducing speed and positioning her vehicle to prevent lane changes. The motorcyclist maintained a safe following distance and signaled for the next exit, successfully leaving the highway at the Cottonwood exit without incident. Despite the motorcyclist's departure, Pamela continued driving erratically, weaving between lanes and exceeding posted speed limits. Traffic cameras positioned at regular intervals captured her vehicle traveling at excessive speeds with aggressive lane changes that forced other drivers to brake suddenly. At approximately 3:15 p.m., while attempting to pass a slower vehicle in the left lane, Pamela lost control during a lane change maneuver. Skid marks later analyzed by accident reconstruction specialists indicated she was traveling well above the speed limit when her vehicle began to slide sideways. Her sedan struck the concrete median barrier at an angle, causing it to roll multiple times. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes and found Pamela trapped in the severely damaged vehicle. Firefighters used hydraulic extraction equipment to remove her from the wreckage. Due to the severity of her injuries and the remote location, she was transported by helicopter to a trauma center in Redding. She was pronounced dead following unsuccessful surgical intervention. The coroner's report cited multiple traumatic injuries consistent with high-speed rollover impact as the cause of death, including severe head trauma, chest injuries, and internal bleeding. Based on available evidence, investigators determined that excessive speed and aggressive driving were the primary contributing factors. It was July 22, 2018, on the Ocoee River in southeastern Tennessee, where scheduled summer releases had pushed cold water into fast, narrow channels. Commercial rafting trips were moving through in close succession, and while the river looked manageable from shore, strong recirculating currents were already forming around exposed rocks beneath the surface. Nina Harrow was 31 and worked as a retail shift supervisor at a home goods chain in Chattanooga. She was dependable, often covered extra shifts, and had begun posting frequently about assertiveness and taking control in everyday situations. Her posts were aimed at coworkers and friends, and focused on correcting others and stepping in when she felt direction was weak. She had no formal outdoor or river experience and relied mostly on general fitness and confidence rather than technical skill. She signed up for the rafting trip with coworkers as a group activity. The Ocoee was running controlled releases that day, higher and colder than normal, with several Class 3 and 4 rapids. The commercial section contained known hazard points, including mid-river boulders that created hydraulics capable of holding swimmers underwater. Guides depended on strict paddle commands, synchronized movement, and keeping all passengers seated low in the raft, because standing removed stability and control during rapid entry. At the launch point, the guide gave a standard safety briefing that covered paddle commands, body position, and the requirement to remain seated through rapids with feet tucked inside the raft. Nina interrupted more than once, making jokes about guides exaggerating danger and saying balance mattered more than following instructions exactly. The guide corrected her and continued, reminding the group that the rules applied to everyone. As the raft approached a known rapid with a lateral wave feeding into a downstream boulder, the guide called for a coordinated forward paddle to maintain alignment. Nina argued that a different angle would be better, and raised her voice over the sound of the water. As the raft entered the rapid slightly offline, she shifted her weight outward and stood on the outer tube with her arms spread, attempting to demonstrate stability. The lateral wave struck the upstream side of the raft, causing it to pitch and roll. With her weight elevated, Nina was thrown off first and hit the water near the downstream edge. The current immediately carried her toward the boulder, where water folded back on itself into a hydraulic that pulled her sideways and down. Video from a trailing raft and the guide's action camera showed her head breaking the surface briefly before being pulled under again. During one cycle, her chest struck the rock edge, forcing the air from her lungs. She surfaced for a moment, gasping, then was pulled back into the recirculating water. The guide threw a rope that brushed her arm but did not catch. A second throw landed closer, but the current dragged her under before she could grab it securely. After several cycles, 2 guides entered the water with ropes and used positioning to disrupt the hydraulic and pull her free into an eddy. She was unresponsive, with bluish skin and no effective breathing. CPR began immediately on shore while emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived approximately 12 minutes later and took over care, but she did not regain a pulse or spontaneous breathing. The medical examiner listed drowning as the primary cause of death, with contributing blunt trauma. Her lungs were bruised, several ribs were fractured, and deep chest contusions were present from repeated impacts against rock. In plain terms, she was held underwater repeatedly and struck hard enough to prevent breathing or effective movement. The incident was documented by guide footage and bystander video, which showed the sequence clearly from the moment she stood up to the rescue attempt. The outfitter reviewed procedures afterward and reinforced briefings about staying seated in rapids. Nina's workplace later organized a small safety fundraiser for regional water rescue training, presented as a reminder that ignoring instructions in hazardous environments can have immediate consequences. It was July 29, 2018. The evening air in Great Smoky Mountains National Park near Gatlinburg, Tennessee, hung thick and humid as campers settled into their sites along the wooded campground. Lacey Lee Turner, a 33-year-old retail worker from Knoxville, stood beside her sedan with her phone positioned on the hood, preparing to capture what she hoped would be her viral breakthrough. The black bear she had been baiting for 3 consecutive nights now lingered just 15 feet away, drawn by the scent of food she had deliberately scattered. At work, Lacey was known for arguing with supervisors, demanding policy exceptions, and escalating minor disagreements into formal complaints. Co-workers described her as someone who routinely asked to speak to managers and threatened to go corporate when she felt disrespected. That same combative personality carried into her online life. She spent most of her off hours cultivating a social media presence built around outrage, entitlement, and defiance, framing herself as someone who stood up to authority. By 2018, she had accumulated roughly 2,400 followers by posting wildlife encounter content from repeated camping trips to the Smokies, often pairing the clips with captions mocking rules, experts, and critics who warned her to stop. The Smoky Mountains host approximately 1,500 black bears across 500,000 acres of protected wilderness. Park regulations strictly prohibit feeding wildlife or storing food improperly, as habituated bears become dangerous and often must be euthanized. Rangers had cited Lacey twice that week for leaving coolers and food scraps outside her tent, warning her that attracting bears was illegal and potentially fatal, and that fed bears are frequently destroyed for public safety. She dismissed their concerns, posting photos of the citations with mocking captions about overprotective authorities. That evening, Lacey had escalated her baiting strategy. She spread honey-coated granola bars in a deliberate trail leading from the tree line to her campsite. A roughly 300-pound adult male black bear followed the scent trail as darkness approached. When the bear reached her immediate area, Lacey grabbed a long stick she had coated with honey and peanut butter, stepping directly into the animal's path. Multiple campers from adjacent sites watched with growing alarm as Lacey cornered the bear between her vehicle and a large oak tree, waving the stick while her phone recorded from a fixed angle atop the car hood. The bear displayed obvious stress signals, making huffing sounds and swaying its head while shifting its weight and hesitating. Lacey moved closer, extending the stick toward the animal's face. 2 campers began shouting warnings, but she ignored them completely. The bear struck suddenly, moving with startling speed for its size. It rose briefly on its hind legs in a reflexive motion, then swiped with its right paw, connecting with Lacey's neck and upper chest before driving her sideways into her car door. She collapsed onto the gravel campsite. Blood poured from ragged lacerations across her throat and shoulder, and the bear immediately fled into the forest after the initial contact. The nearest camper, a retired firefighter, reached Lacey within seconds and attempted to control the bleeding using a towel, but the neck wounds were catastrophic. His wife called emergency services at 7:43 p.m., while other campers ran to alert park staff. Park rangers arrived 14 minutes later, followed by paramedics who transported Lacey to a regional medical center. She was pronounced dead at 8:34 p.m. The medical examiner determined death resulted from massive trauma to the neck, causing complete airway collapse and severe blood loss from severed arteries. Park officials tracked and located the bear in the surrounding area, euthanizing it 2 days later after linking it to the incident through investigative findings that included DNA recovered from the scene. Lacey's phone footage was secured and forensically copied by park authorities as part of the investigative record, never released publicly.
It was August 3rd, 2017. The afternoon sun beat down on a mid-tier hotel pool in Seminyak, Bali, where families splashed in the shallow end and tourists lounged under rented umbrellas. Diane Mitchell, a 48-year-old administrative manager from Perth, Australia, sat rigid in her deck chair, visibly irritated by the noise around her. Diane had earned a reputation back home for being difficult. Neighbors complained about her filing noise complaints against children playing in their yards. Her homeowners association record showed multiple disputes over minor infractions. Co-workers described her as controlling and quick to escalate disagreements into formal complaints. They said she approached life with a rigid sense of order, believing rules applied absolutely to everyone except herself when inconvenient. This trip to Bali was supposed to be a reset after being forced into stress leave following workplace conflicts, but Diane's confrontational nature traveled with her. The hotel pool area was designed for family use, with designated quiet zones clearly marked away from the main swimming area. Diane had deliberately chosen a lounger in the active family section, despite staff suggesting the adults-only pool on the property's other side. She refused to move, insisting she had the right to sit where she pleased, and staff did not want to escalate the disagreement. She spent the morning glaring at children and muttering complaints to other guests, most of whom ignored her increasingly hostile demeanor. Around 2:15 in the afternoon, a 14-year-old Indonesian boy named Adi accidentally splashed water near Diane's chair while playing with friends. Diane exploded from her seat, screaming profanities at the teenager. Adi apologized immediately in broken English, but Diane continued her tirade, demanding he be removed from the pool area. Hotel staff began approaching to de-escalate the situation. Before staff could intervene, Diane spotted Adi's tablet device sitting poolside and grabbed it. Multiple witnesses watched in shock as she held it over the water, taunting the boy before hurling it into the deep end. The expensive device sank immediately to the pool's 8-foot-deep bottom. Adi, panicked about losing his family's only tablet, dove after it without hesitation, despite being an inexperienced swimmer. Staff were momentarily distracted by other guests, and initial shouts were mistaken for horseplay, so no one reached the boy immediately. The boy struggled underwater, his movements visible through the clear water, as he grasped the tablet but couldn't push himself back up. His friends screamed for help. Diane stood at the pool, arms crossed. Adi's father, who had been inside the hotel, came running as the on-duty lifeguard and hotel security entered the water. The chaotic rescue attempt took nearly 45 seconds. Adi was pulled out after struggling underwater due to panic and the weight of the tablet, and CPR was initiated immediately while someone called emergency services. During the commotion, Adi's uncle, witnessing the entire incident and overcome with rage, shoved through the crowd and struck Diane once in the face with a closed fist. The punch sent Diane stumbling backward. Her feet slipped on the wet tiles, and she fell hard, the back of her skull impacting the slick concrete pool, coping with a sickening crack. She collapsed onto the deck, blood from a scalp laceration immediately pooling beneath her head. Paramedics arrived following a call from the staff. Adi regained consciousness and survived. Diane did not. She was pronounced dead at a local hospital 90 minutes later. The coroner's report identified severe skull fractures at the base of her head, massive internal bleeding between her brain and skull, and fatal brain swelling. Death resulted from blunt force trauma to the head sustained in the fall. Addie's uncle was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. He received a suspended sentence. Diane's family settled civil claims filed by the hotel and Addie's family for property destruction and endangerment.
It was October 4th, 2016, in Estes Park, Colorado. The sky over a mountain park meadow was clear and cool in the late afternoon light. The aspen trees along the eastern meadows had turned a full yellow. Fall season was in full swing, drawing visitors who lined the meadow edges to witness the annual rut. Diane Kowalski was 52 years old and lived in Aurora, Colorado. She had driven to the park that afternoon with her adult son to see the elk. She worked as a homeowners association coordinator and, according to her son, was accustomed to being the one who set the rules rather than followed them. She had visited the park once before and told nearby visitors she understood elk behavior and believed the safety barriers were excessive. She carried a digital camera with a zoom lens, but felt the posted viewing distance did not allow for the photos she wanted. At the center of the meadow, a bull elk weighing approximately 720 pounds stood among several cows. The bull had been bugling for over an hour, asserting dominance over the herd. Rangers had posted bright orange signs at trailheads and meadow entrances reading, "Elk rutting season. Stay 75 feet from all wildlife. Bull elk are dangerous." Rope barriers marked the safe viewing boundary. A ranger was stationed at the north end of the meadow and had already redirected several visitors that evening. At 5:40 in the afternoon, Diane stepped over the rope barrier to get closer shots of the bull and the cows. Her son called after her and told her to come back. She waved him off and walked toward the herd with her camera raised, closing the distance to roughly 30 feet from the nearest cow. Several nearby visitors verbally warned her that she was too close, but she ignored their warnings. Diane paused briefly to take multiple photographs, repositioning slightly to improve her angle. The bull, which had been facing slightly away, turned and fixed on her movement. His head lowered, his antlers angled forward. Within seconds, his steady walk accelerated into a charge. Diane turned and ran, but she had covered less than 15 feet when the bull caught up to her. He struck her from behind with his chest and antlers, knocking her forcefully to the ground. The impact forced the air from her lungs. He stepped on her before pivoting back toward the herd. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. The ranger stationed nearby had already begun moving when he saw her cross the barrier, but he was too far away to intervene before the charge occurred. Bystanders backed away as he reached her and radioed for emergency response. Paramedics arrived at 6:04 p.m. Diane had sustained a puncture wound to her lower back, 2 fractured vertebrae, a collapsed lung, and significant blunt force trauma to her hip and leg. She was stabilized at the scene and airlifted to a medical center, where she underwent emergency surgery that evening. Despite intervention, she developed complications from internal bleeding and did not survive. She was pronounced dead the following morning, October 5th. After the incident, rangers reinforced existing wildlife distance messaging and reminded visitors that bull elk during rut season are territorial and can charge without prolonged warning. It was January 21st, 2013. At a shopping mall in Charlotte, North Carolina, the central fountain sat drained and surrounded by yellow caution tape. Most shoppers ignored it. Inside the basin, a temporary circulation pump rested near the wall, plugged into a nearby outlet while bright orange signs warned that electrical maintenance was underway. Genevieve Moore, 49, stood near the barrier studying the space. She ran a small fashion page from her townhouse in Huntersville and worked part-time at a cosmetics counter inside the mall. Her audience was modest, but she treated every post like a professional shoot, often staging photos in public spaces to make them appear exclusive. Mall management had already warned her twice about filming without permission. Co-workers said she dismissed rules as obstacles to creativity. Earlier that day, she posted a clip of the drained fountain, describing it as a perfect backdrop that management had prevented her from using. By mid-afternoon, she returned with a tripod and tote bag. The fountain had been closed while a technician installed a temporary pump connected to power. Its metal housing sat inside the basin, awaiting a bonding screw that would complete the grounding. Though from above it looked like ordinary maintenance equipment. Witnesses said Genevieve paced along the barrier, irritated that the fountain was empty. When a store employee warned the area was closed for electrical work, she insisted she only needed a moment and stepped over the caution tape anyway. Inside the basin, she unfolded the tripod and positioned it toward the skylight overhead. The stone floor was completely dry, which made the space look flat in the camera preview. Several shoppers recalled hearing her complain loudly that the lighting looked dead without water. A janitorial cart stood nearby with a cleaning bucket. Genevieve wheeled it toward a restroom and returned a few minutes later with it partially filled. She began pouring the water across the concrete floor, spreading it outward with the sole of her shoe to create a thin, reflective surface. The water flowed slowly toward the pump housing and collected along the lower edge of the basin. To avoid leaving visible footprints, she removed her shoes and stepped barefoot into the shallow water. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on adjusting the camera angle, repeatedly walking back and forth to check the reflection. At one point, she reached for the stainless steel railing along the edge of the basin to steady herself while repositioning the tripod. Witnesses later said her posture changed suddenly. Her shoulders lifted and her arms locked as she gripped the rail. The tripod tipped onto the wet concrete. There was no flash or loud sound, only the hum of the pump. Within seconds, she collapsed into the shallow water. A kiosk employee ran for help. Security arrived and saw her hand still against the metal railing. One guard used a wooden display board to push her arm away, while another shut off power at a nearby breaker panel. Emergency services were called around 3:20 p.m. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began CPR. She had no pulse and was not breathing. A defibrillator delivered shocks at the scene and during transport, but she was pronounced dead after about 30 minutes of resuscitation. Investigators later found small electrical burns on her palm and heel. The fountain pump had not been properly grounded, and the water layer created a conductive path when she touched the railing. The death was ruled ventricular fibrillation from electric shock. It was November 12, 2018, on Pennsylvania state game lands in northern Pennsylvania during the peak of deer hunting season. Weather conditions were clear with temperatures in the low 40s. The area was popular among hunters due to its dense deer population and well-maintained trail system with clearly marked boundaries. A property dispute would escalate into a fatal firearms accident when an angry confrontation turned physical. Sharon Pike, 55, had recently retired from her position as a retail manager at a regional department store chain. Neighbors described her to investigators as frequently disputing property boundaries in her rural community, often confronting hikers and hunters whom she believed were trespassing. Her property bordered the state game lands, creating ongoing confusion about exact boundary lines despite posted signage. Sharon had a documented history of confronting outdoor enthusiasts in the area, including a 2016 incident where she called police on a family of hikers using a public trail. Local records showed multiple complaints filed by Sharon against the State Parks Department regarding boundary maintenance and signage placement. That morning, a group of 4 licensed hunters had established positions in accordance with state regulations, approximately 150 yards from the nearest property boundary. They possessed all required permits and safety equipment. The group included 2 experienced hunters who had been using the area for over a decade without previous incidents. Sharon approached the group around 10:30 a.m. and accused them of trespassing on what she believed was private property adjacent to her land. A hunter who witnessed the initial confrontation reported Sharon making accusations about their positioning and demanding they leave the area immediately. The hunters attempted to show her their permits and explain the public land designation using maps and GPS coordinates. Despite explanations about the public land status and proper boundary markers, Sharon became increasingly agitated and stepped inside the marked safety perimeter that hunters had established around their position. State hunting regulations require maintaining safe distances and clear sight lines, which Sharon's presence disrupted, according to witness statements. Sharon grabbed a rifle from one of the hunters while attempting to demonstrate what she considered unsafe positioning. The rifle, a .30-06 bolt-action hunting rifle, was loaded and ready for hunting use. Unfamiliar with firearm handling procedures, Sharon placed her finger inside the trigger guard while pointing the weapon in an unsafe direction. The rifle discharged immediately, striking Sharon in the upper torso. The hunters immediately called for emergency assistance while attempting to provide first aid using their basic wilderness medical supplies. The remote location required emergency responders to access the area using all-terrain vehicles, creating a 25-minute response time. Emergency medical technicians attempted advanced trauma care but pronounced Sharon dead at the scene. The coroner's report cited a single gunshot wound to the chest, with damage to major organs and major blood vessels as the cause of death, with rapid blood loss preventing survival. Despite immediate medical intervention, based on available evidence, investigators ruled the death accidental, citing improper handling of a loaded weapon by someone unfamiliar with basic firearm safety protocols. It was January 18, 2013, at Alta, Utah, near a ski boundary that had been closed overnight after heavy snowfall. Fresh snow lay deep and quiet. Warning signs were posted, gates were locked, and ski patrol was active along the line. The slope looked calm from below, but the snowpack was unstable and waiting for a trigger. Kara Mullen was 41 and worked as a residential real estate agent in Salt Lake City. She sold mid-range homes and regularly filmed short videos to promote listings and herself. Ski trips were part of that image. She posted often, tracked views and comments, and treated public spaces as places where confidence and persistence usually got results. People who knew her described her as direct, impatient, and unwilling to accept restrictions. Kara skied often, but only within resort systems, using rented gear and relying on patrol to manage hazards. Alta's terrain naturally funnels wind-blown snow into bowls and narrow gullies. After storms, layers of snow can rest on weak surfaces and fail suddenly. Patrol manages this risk with closures and controlled releases, but the system depends on skiers staying out of closed areas. That morning followed a night of heavy snow and strong winds that loaded the slope above the boundary. Patrol closed the gate for avalanche control and posted warnings explaining the risk. Kara arrived with two acquaintances, stopped near the rope line, and began filming. She confronted patrol, arguing that her lift ticket gave her access and dismissing the danger despite posted ratings and morning safety notices. Patrol told her a release would be triggered upslope and asked her to move back. Kara continued recording, raised her voice, and pointed her skis downhill. When told again to step away, she ducked under the rope and slid several yards into the closed area, still shouting toward the gate as nearby skiers stopped and watched. Minutes later, patrol followed standard procedures to clear the hazard. The timing was routine for post-storm conditions. Kara was still inside the boundary, moving slowly across the slope with her camera out, ignoring shouted warnings from both above and below, while the snow remained stiff, connected, and ready to break. A crack raced across the slope in a straight line, and a single slab broke free. Dense snow began moving downhill at once. Kara tried to turn, but the slab caught her skis, twisted her legs sideways, and dropped her onto her back. She was carried immediately, rolled as the slide thickened, and pushed toward a narrow gully. She was slammed into a buried rock, crushing her ribs and shoulder, and her helmet split on impact. The moving snow packed around her chest and face, locking her in place. The pressure prevented her lungs from expanding, one arm pinned beneath her body, and within seconds she stopped moving as the debris settled hard around her. Other skiers saw the fracture and contacted patrol immediately. Responders reached the site within minutes, guided by fresh tracks and the last place she had been seen. They cleared her face and airway, but she was not breathing. CPR was started after she was pulled free, but her chest could not rise due to injuries and compression. The medical examiner later reported death from traumatic asphyxia combined with blunt injuries. In simple terms, the packed snow prevented her from breathing, and broken ribs and bruised lungs made survival impossible. Death occurred before rescue efforts could restore breathing. After the incident, patrol installed a solid barricade at that boundary during avalanche control periods. It was January 22, 2017. A popular downtown Toronto coffee shop buzzed with Sunday afternoon traffic, voices overlapping beneath the hiss of the espresso machine. Nina Tremblay sat across from Samir Hassan at a small corner table, arms folded, coffee untouched, mid-complaint. Another routine confrontation in a life shaped by friction, unaware it would be the last one she ever made. Nina had graduated 4 years earlier with a marketing degree from a mid-tier Ontario college, but chronic workplace conflicts had left her cycling through temp jobs and retail positions. Friends described her as intelligent but combative. She'd been fired 3 times in 2 years, always insisting she was standing up for herself against disrespect. Samir, a junior accountant she'd matched with on a dating app, knew none of this background when he suggested meeting at the coffee shop near his condo. The date had started awkwardly. Nina complained about the lighting, the music volume, and the chair wobbling. 15 minutes in, she marched to the counter, demanding a refund because the drink was supposedly lukewarm. The barista politely offered to remake it, explaining the thermometer showed all drinks left the machine at proper temperature. Nina's voice rose. She insisted the temperature was unacceptable and demanded her money back immediately. The shift supervisor, trained in de-escalation, calmly refused the refund, but again offered a fresh drink at no charge. Nina's face flushed red. She grabbed a freshly prepared drink waiting on the pickup counter, a scalding beverage just pulled from the espresso machine, and deliberately dumped the entire contents across the polished marble floor while shouting about customer service. Other patrons backed away as the steaming liquid spread rapidly across the reflective surface. The supervisor immediately reached for the phone to call 911, while another employee moved toward the counter area. Nina continued her tirade. She gestured wildly, her attention focused entirely on the staff behind the counter. Still yelling, she took 3 aggressive steps backward toward her table where Samir sat frozen with embarrassment. Her left boot slid forward as it hit the expanding pool of coffee. The liquid had reduced surface friction to nearly nothing on the polished marble. Nina's legs shot forward as her center of mass pitched backward. She fell with full body weight, her trajectory carrying her backward at an angle. The base of her skull struck the exposed stainless steel corner of a refrigerated display case with devastating force. Witnesses later described a sharp, sickening crack that echoed across the shop. Nina's body went instantly limp, her eyes open but unseeing. Blood pooled rapidly beneath her head, spreading across the floor. A customer with nursing experience checked for breathing and found none, immediately calling emergency services. When paramedics arrived at the coffee shop, Nina had no pulse and was not breathing, and attempts to revive her were unsuccessful. A later examination by the coroner confirmed she had suffered a severe fracture at the base of her skull, which caused critical damage to the part of the brain responsible for breathing and heart function, making it clear that the injury shut down her body almost immediately and left no chance of survival. Investigators reviewed statements from multiple witnesses and determined the death was accidental, resulting directly from Nina's own reckless behavior. No charges were filed against the coffee shop or staff. Samir provided a written statement describing Nina's escalating aggression throughout their brief date, which corroborated the evidence. The criminal investigation concluded within 2 weeks, with the coroner's formal report issued afterward, closing the case without further action.
It was March 12th, 2013. The Swiss Alps stretched under deceptively calm skies, hiding dangers that would claim a life before sunset. Greta Zimmerman, a 65-year-old retired schoolteacher from Zurich, was at the base of a restricted avalanche zone with her husband Klaus, drawn by terrain that would test her lifelong habit of bending rules for recognition. Greta had spent 40 years hiking alpine trails, accumulating an impressive catalog of summit photos and trail completions across Switzerland and Austria. She had a reputation among fellow hikers as someone who argued loudly with rangers and staff. She frequently told other hikers that particular signages were ridiculous and that she deserved access because she was experienced and had hiked these mountains for decades. Friends described her as fearless but dismissive of authority, and she often escalated minor disputes into verbal confrontations over perceived restrictions. Alpine hiking demands respect for rapidly changing conditions, where avalanche-prone slopes can release without warning when snowpack stability deteriorates, requiring constant assessment of terrain features and weather patterns that determine whether a trail remains passable or becomes a deadly trap. Although experienced, she had left her avalanche transceiver and airbag behind that morning, saying she only planned a quick shot. That morning, regional avalanche services had issued critical warnings across the Alps. Fresh snowfall throughout the previous week had created unstable layers, and rising temperatures were destabilizing snowpack on south-facing slopes. Multiple trails near the popular resort area where Greta and Klaus were staying had been closed with barriers and prominent warning signs detailing extreme avalanche danger. Weather bulletins explicitly warned against any off-piste activity or venturing near closed trails. Klaus urged Greta to stay within the resort boundaries, pointing to the warning signs and recent avalanche bulletins posted at the base lodge. She dismissed his concerns, saying the closed trail offered perfect photo opportunities and that authorities were overly cautious. Other hikers at the lodge noticed the couple's discussion and watched as Greta approached the barrier marking the restricted zone. Greta had ducked under the barrier and walked approximately 300 feet up the closed trail. Klaus remained at the barrier, visibly distressed. Several guests at the base lodge watched through the large windows as Greta positioned herself for a selfie against the mountain backdrop. A guest raised binoculars. Above her, the massive snowfield showed subtle signs of instability that she either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The slope angle exceeded 35 degrees, well within the critical range for slab avalanche formation. The vibrations from her movement triggered the release. The snowfield fractured with a deep crack that propagated rapidly across the slope. Witnesses at the lodge saw the entire mountainside begin moving, a massive wall of snow cascading downward with terrifying speed. Trees snapped like twigs as the avalanche gained momentum, consuming everything in its path. Greta disappeared instantly into the churning white mass. Klaus screamed for help as the avalanche thundered past, stopping roughly 150 feet from where he stood. Lodge staff immediately contacted mountain rescue services. The avalanche had deposited debris across a wide area, burying the trail under tons of compacted snow. Rescue teams arrived within 30 to 40 minutes with probes and avalanche search dogs. The dogs helped narrow search areas, but careful probing and shovel lines were still required. Rescuers located Greta's body 4 hours later, after a prolonged search, by which point survival was, tragically, no longer realistic. She had died from asphyxiation, her airways completely blocked by snow she'd inhaled during the tumbling descent. The medical examiner noted multiple traumatic injuries from colliding with trees and debris during the avalanche's violent descent, along with evidence of hypothermia that contributed to her death. Klaus returned to Zurich with Greta's remains. A small funeral was held at the local cemetery, attended by close family and a few hiking friends.
It was February 11th, 2018, in Columbus, Ohio, and the temperature had fallen to 14 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A prolonged cold snap forced furnaces across the city to run almost continuously, placing extra strain on aging heating systems. Inside a modest single-story home on Millbrook Drive, the air felt warm but heavy, the windows closed tightly against the winter wind. Sharon Kimball, 61, had lived in the house for more than 2 decades and prided herself on handling maintenance without outside help. She had recently scaled back from full-time office work and spent most mornings at home. A gas furnace and water heater operated from a small utility room off the hallway, where a combination smoke and carbon monoxide detector had been installed 2 years earlier. During the week leading up to the incident, the detector alarmed multiple times. Each alert irritated her further, and she convinced herself the device was overly sensitive rather than signaling a real problem. After the third alarm sounded late on February 10th, she removed the unit from the wall, unplugged it, and placed it in a kitchen drawer before returning to bed. By mid-morning the next day, the furnace cycled repeatedly as outdoor temperatures remained low. A hairline crack inside the heat exchanger, later identified during inspection, allowed combustion gases to mix with the heated air circulating through the house. Without the detector active, carbon monoxide accumulated gradually. Sharon moved between the kitchen and living room, tidying paperwork and preparing coffee. Unaware that the gas was building to dangerous levels, she began to feel fatigued and slightly dizzy, symptoms that progressed slowly enough to seem like ordinary exhaustion. As the furnace continued running, her coordination worsened. She sat on the couch, leaning back as the room grew quiet except for the steady hum of the heating system. Around 9 a.m., her daughter called but received no answer. Inside the house, Sharon attempted to stand but lost balance, lowering herself back onto the cushions. The exposure intensified, reducing oxygen delivery to her brain. By late morning, she was no longer able to respond to phone calls or movement around her. When her daughter arrived shortly after 11 a.m. and entered with a spare key, she found the living room unusually still and Sharon unconscious on the couch. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes and began oxygen therapy while ventilating the home. Hospital testing later revealed severely elevated carboxyhemoglobin levels, confirming prolonged carbon monoxide exposure. Despite aggressive treatment, the damage from oxygen deprivation proved irreversible. Sharon remained in critical condition for 2 days before dying on February 13th. Post-incident inspection confirmed the cracked heat exchanger as the source of the leak and verified that the earlier alarms had been responding to genuine low-level exposure. Local safety officials used the case during winter outreach campaigns to emphasize annual furnace inspections and the importance of keeping carbon monoxide detectors active, especially during extended cold weather when heating systems operate under constant strain. It was July 9th, 2018. The Seine drifted under a pale evening sky as tour boats passed beneath the stone bridges of central Paris. On one vessel's open upper deck, passengers shifted in their seats while a crew member repeated a routine warning. The next bridge had low clearance and everyone needed to remain seated. Near the front rail stood Regina Clark, 60, visiting from Surrey, England. She ran a small retirement lifestyle page aimed mostly at women her age. Travel photos, restaurant reviews, and short posts about staying active after 60. The account produced a modest stream of advertising income that supplemented her pension, and the Paris trip had been planned around a week of scheduled content she intended to post in real time. Before retirement, Regina had spent 3 decades as a regional furniture sales manager. Former colleagues described her as organized and persistent, but also someone who rarely accepted being corrected once she had made up her mind. She had chronic neck stiffness from cervical arthritis and attended physiotherapy twice a month, but she often brushed off medical advice and insisted she refused to slow down for age. The evening river cruise was meant to produce simple photos for her page. The lower deck was enclosed and crowded, so Regina moved to the open upper level for a clearer skyline view. Several bridges along the route passed close enough that passengers were required to remain seated below the height of the metal rail. As the boat approached one of the narrower arches, a deckhand walked down the aisle repeating the same warning he had already given earlier in the trip. Everyone needed to sit or lean down until the boat cleared the bridge. Several passengers later recalled Regina remaining at the rail with her phone raised, angling it toward the approaching arch. When the crew member asked her to sit, witnesses said she waved him off and continued recording, insisting she only needed a quick photo. The deckhand pointed again toward the bridge and repeated that the clearance was low. Instead of sitting, Regina stepped onto a fixed wooden bench, lifting herself higher above the rail to frame the shot. Passengers seated nearby later said she continued speaking loudly, complaining that the crew was overreacting and that she had done similar photos on other trips without problems. As the vessel approached Pont de l'Alma, the captain reduced speed to about 6 knots, normal for that section of the river. Most people on the upper deck leaned forward or lowered their heads as the stone arch filled the frame ahead. Regina remained standing on the bench. Images later recovered from her phone showed she was still taking photos as the boat entered the bridge. The clearance above the bench was too low. Passengers heard an impact as her head struck the underside of the arch, knocking her off balance. She fell backward onto the wooden deck, and her phone slid across the floor toward a drainage seam. A passenger pressed the emergency call button at 8:17 p.m. Crew reached Regina within seconds and found her unresponsive. The captain stopped the boat and contacted river authorities. A river patrol unit arrived about 8 minutes later and transferred her to the quay, where paramedics attempted resuscitation, but she was pronounced dead. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death fatal cervical trauma from the overhead impact. Investigators confirmed the vessel had slowed and that crew warnings had been issued before the bridge. Most passengers were seated. Authorities concluded Regina had stood above the safe clearance level despite instructions. After the incident, the operator installed larger warning signs and additional barriers on the upper deck. It was August 23, 2017, on Interstate 80 near Reno, Nevada, during peak afternoon traffic. Temperatures reached 98 degrees Fahrenheit under clear skies. A construction project along the highway had narrowed the shoulder and compressed traffic into fewer lanes, creating limited room for error in an area already prone to vehicle breakdowns due to steep grades and heat stress. Denise Keller was 49 years old and worked as a real estate assistant for a property management company in Carson City. Co-workers later described her as someone who frequently challenged instructions from supervisors and contractors, particularly when advice came from people she believed were less experienced. Company records documented prior disputes in which Denise dismissed safety guidance and attempted to override professional recommendations during property inspections. On the afternoon of the incident, Denise's 2003 Honda Civic overheated while climbing a long grade outside Reno. She pulled onto the narrow shoulder approximately 200 yards before a construction merge zone, where traffic slowed abruptly and vehicles shifted lanes with limited visibility. The reduced shoulder width left little space between her vehicle, the guardrail, and passing traffic. A highway patrol officer arrived within minutes after receiving the breakdown report. A tow truck driver already staged nearby due to construction later reported that Denise immediately resisted assistance. Witnesses noted that she questioned the officer's competence after hearing his accent and declined repeated offers to move farther from traffic or wait inside a patrol vehicle while arrangements were made to clear the disabled car. The officer attempted to explain the risks of remaining on the shoulder in a construction corridor, citing the limited clearance and the likelihood of passing vehicles drifting toward the shoulder as drivers focused on merging traffic ahead. Witnesses reported that Denise openly questioned the officer's competence, repeatedly referencing his accent and background as reasons she did not trust his instructions. She dismissed the warnings and remained near the driver's side of her vehicle, refusing to follow guidance she believed came from someone unqualified to advise her. As traffic density increased, vehicles passed within feet of the disabled car. The officer continued urging Denise to step behind the guardrail, but she refused and stayed in the narrow gap between her vehicle and the barrier. The tow truck driver later reported growing concern as heavy trucks began moving through the merge area at reduced but uneven speeds, while Denise remained exposed and uncooperative. At approximately 3:47 p.m., a commercial truck hauling construction materials approached the breakdown location. The driver later told investigators that his attention was focused on merging traffic ahead and the narrowing lane configuration. As the truck passed the disabled vehicle, its right mirror assembly clipped the Honda Civic, forcing the car sideways. The sudden movement pinned Denise between the vehicle and the guardrail. She was thrown violently against the metal barrier, sustaining catastrophic injuries. The patrol officer immediately initiated emergency medical care while requesting advanced life support. Denise was transported to a regional medical center where trauma teams attempted surgical intervention. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The coroner determined the cause of death to be massive internal injuries resulting from blunt force trauma. The incident was later incorporated into regional highway safety training materials, emphasizing the dangers of refusing professional assistance and remaining exposed during roadside emergencies in active traffic zones. It was September 7, 2017, in Sedona, Arizona, at a crowded Red Rock overlook where clear skies and calm weather drew steady foot traffic throughout the day. The view appeared stable and inviting, but erosion beneath the surface had weakened the edge, leaving little margin for error near the steep drop. Dana Pike was 28 and worked as a hairstylist at a mid-range salon outside Phoenix. She was reliable with clients, steady with coloring work, and focused on moving into a better shop. She used social media to support that goal, filming short travel videos meant to show confidence and polish. Nothing was sponsored, but she treated visibility as professional leverage. She planned the Sedona trip around filming. Dana preferred shots taken close to open space, where the background looked wide and uninterrupted. Friends said she disliked being hurried and often held her position once she set up. She carried a small tripod, a phone with a wide-angle lens, and wore smooth-soled sneakers. She had no training in climbing or rock stability and assumed that a popular overlook was safe because it was frequently used. That afternoon, hikers moved in and out of the overlook, taking turns at the front edge. Dana set her tripod near the front and began recording. People behind her asked to pass. She waved them off and continued filming, speaking toward the phone while holding her spot. A small sign and a line of rocks marked where visitors were advised to stop. She stepped beyond that line to widen the frame. The surface looked level, but the rock was fractured sandstone shaped by erosion. Shallow cracks were visible on top, with larger voids underneath. The area had been flagged informally by rangers but remained open. Dana adjusted her stance, turned her upper body toward the camera, and placed her right heel close to a thin seam in the rock. The first break was minor. A sharp crack was heard as a small piece of stone snapped loose, and her heel dropped slightly. She reacted by spreading her arms and shifting her weight outward. The crack widened immediately. A larger section of rock tilted forward, scraping as it began to slide. The slab detached completely. Dana fell with it, dropping roughly 200 feet down a steep field of loose rock. Her shoulder struck first, twisting her body. Her head hit next, followed by her chest. She continued to tumble, striking jagged stone multiple times before stopping against a cluster of boulders below. Dana's tripod remained standing near the boundary. Her phone was recovered nearby, still recording, capturing the cracking sound, a sudden rush of air, and the image spinning upward before stopping. Emergency services were called immediately, but access was limited by terrain. Ranger teams reached the area on foot first, followed by paramedics. Dana showed no signs of life when responders arrived, and death was pronounced at the scene. The coroner reported multiple blunt force injuries. Her skull was fractured with severe brain damage. Several ribs were broken, both lungs had collapsed, and there was extensive internal bleeding. The cause of death was massive trauma from a fall from height, with injuries that would have been fatal within minutes. The incident was confirmed through witness accounts, phone footage, and the displaced rock slab, which had broken cleanly from the edge. That section of the overlook was closed the same day. At the salon where Dana worked, co-workers placed an empty chair with her scissors and combs on the seat. Rangers later added clearer warnings and used the incident in safety briefings to explain how erosion can cause sudden failure, even in heavily visited areas. It was April 27, 2018. The residential district of Chamberí in Madrid, Spain, sat under a hazy afternoon sun. Rosa Delgado, a 34-year-old part-time reseller who had built a side income flipping goods online, was about to make a decision that would end her life in one of the most preventable ways imaginable. Rosa had earned a reputation among local delivery workers as confrontational and aggressive. Over the previous 18 months, she'd been accused by 3 separate courier services of intercepting packages meant for neighbors in her apartment complex. She denied everything, often screaming at drivers who questioned her, threatening to file complaints about their service. Online reselling had become Rosa's primary income after losing her retail job 2 years prior, and neighbors noticed increasing desperation in her behavior. Witness accounts said that she would loiter near building entrances during peak delivery hours, sometimes following couriers up stairwells. Property management had received multiple complaints, but without concrete proof, no action was taken against her lease. Package theft in urban Spanish apartment buildings had become increasingly common by 2018, and a handful of fringe delivery startups had begun quietly testing unauthorized drone drop-offs onto balconies and rooftops, despite such flights being prohibited over populated areas by Spanish aviation authorities. The practice remained rare, controversial, and highly visible when it occurred. Balconies in older Madrid buildings, particularly those constructed in the 1970s, featured decorative iron railings attached with mounting brackets that corroded over decades of exposure to rain and temperature fluctuations. These railings were never designed to bear significant weight or withstand climbing stress, serving purely aesthetic and light safety purposes. That afternoon, Rosa spotted a delivery drone placing a package on a 4th-floor balcony 3 units over from her 3rd-floor apartment. The building's CCTV system captured her emerging onto her own balcony at 3:42 in the afternoon, eyeing the package. The item sat clearly visible, a medium-sized box marked with a premium electronics retailer's logo. Rather than attempting to access it through legitimate means or simply ignoring it, Rosa made the catastrophic decision to climb between balconies. The horizontal distance was roughly 4 feet, with a 40-foot drop to the concrete courtyard below. Building surveillance showed Rosa stepping onto her balcony railing, testing her weight briefly before committing. She reached for the neighboring balcony's decorative ironwork, gripping the vertical bars with both hands. For approximately 3 seconds, she hung suspended between balconies, her feet searching for purchase on the adjoining ledge. The corroded embedded anchors securing the railing to the masonry had been weakening for years, hidden behind decorative plasterwork that concealed the rust eating through the metal anchors. The decorative ironwork was not rated to support lateral or bridging loads. The bracket failed completely. The entire decorative railing section separated from the wall with Rosa still gripping it. A courtyard-facing security camera mounted on the opposite facade captured her sudden disappearance from frame, showing only a grainy silhouette and a visible timestamp as she fell 4 stories, the heavy ironwork falling with her. A neighbor hanging laundry on the ground floor heard the impact and immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, finding Rosa unresponsive in the courtyard with the twisted railing beside her. The medical examiner's report stated she suffered multiple blunt force injuries, including severe spinal fractures, traumatic brain injury from skull impact, massive internal bleeding from ruptured liver and spleen, and crushed ribs that punctured both lungs. The injuries were immediately unsurvivable and consistent with death on impact. The CCTV footage became key evidence in the subsequent investigation. Authorities closed the case as accidental death resulting from criminal trespass attempt, with no criminal charges laid against the deceased. Building management inspected all exterior railings, finding 12 additional units with dangerously corroded mounts.
It was February 23rd, 2015. The Gold Coast beaches stretched under deceptively inviting skies, the kind of afternoon that drew families to the water, despite conditions that would prove deadly. Kylie Goldstein, 34, was about to make a series of decisions that would cost her everything. Kylie had lived on the Gold Coast for 8 years, moving from Brisbane after her divorce. Her 2 children, ages 7 and 9, often appeared hesitant around her, and neighbors had witnessed multiple public confrontations where Kylie berated them for minor infractions. She had accumulated 3 formal complaints from the local surf lifesaving club for previous incidents where she had argued with lifeguards. Swimming and beach activities formed Kylie's only reliable bonding time with her children, something she planned rigidly every weekend, regardless of conditions. She viewed beach safety warnings as suggestions rather than rules, evident from frequently telling other parents that lifeguards were overly cautious and that she knew the beaches well enough to make her own decisions. That afternoon, red flags lined the beach at a popular swimming area, warning of dangerous rip currents generated by offshore storm systems. Surf life-saving officers had announced beach closure over loudspeakers 3 times between 1 o'clock and 2:30 in the afternoon. Most families had already packed up and left. Kylie arrived with her children, immediately spotting the red flags. Her son pointed them out, asking if they should go home. According to the kids, Kylie told him they were swimming, or they would lose screen privileges for a month. At the water's edge, a lifeguard approached and explained the closure. Kylie interrupted repeatedly, demanding to know his qualifications and insisting the water looked fine from where she stood. The lifeguard radioed for backup as Kylie raised her voice, attracting attention from the dozen remaining beachgoers. She lectured him about taxpayer rights and overregulation, while her children stood behind her, clearly uncomfortable. When the lifeguard turned to address another family, Kylie grabbed her children by their wrists and pulled them into the water. They waded to waist depth within 90 seconds. The rip current, invisible from shore but devastating in force, caught all 3 immediately. The beach's steep nearshore shelf meant waist depth came quickly as they stepped out, and the rip formed a strong seaward channel just beyond the breaker line. The children began screaming as the current dragged them seaward. Kylie, likely realizing the danger too late, panicked and tried swimming directly against the current, exhausting herself instantly. 4 lifeguards entered the water within 30 seconds of her submergence. One paddled a rescue board, while another secured a rescue tube, and an inflatable rescue boat was launched and stood by for recovery. Following protocol, they prioritized the children, who were closer and more manageable. 2 lifeguards reached the kids within 2 minutes, securing them on rescue boards. Kylie was now 200 feet offshore, flailing wildly and screaming incoherently. Her panicked movements accelerated her fatigue. 2 lifeguards swam toward her position, but a large set of waves pushed her under. She resurfaced briefly, arms thrashing, before disappearing beneath the surface. The crew called emergency services immediately when they lost sight of Kylie. Visibility in the churned water made her location impossible. A multi-agency search involving surf life-saving teams, water police, and helicopter units continued until nightfall and resumed at dawn. Kylie's body washed ashore 2 days later, discovered by early morning walkers 3 kilometers south. Prevailing currents and wind likely carried the body along shore. The incident was later reviewed through a coronial investigation, and updated safety signage was installed at the beach entrance following the findings. Her children received mandatory trauma counseling funded by Victim Services.
It was September 9th, 2017, in Phoenix, Arizona, and the afternoon heat had climbed to 106 degrees. The desert air shimmered above the concrete, and waves of heat rose visibly from the tarmac beyond the terminal windows. Susan Cho was 47 years old and worked as a regional sales director for a logistics company based in the city. Her role required frequent travel, and colleagues described her as highly detail-oriented and quick to challenge policies she believed were inefficient. She flew often and was accustomed to navigating airline procedures herself. When her checked suitcase failed to appear at baggage claim, her irritation escalated almost immediately. She stated loudly that she had watched the bag being loaded and criticized the staff's handling of the situation as unacceptable. Within minutes, she demanded a supervisor, repeating that she traveled constantly and believed she understood how airline systems worked. She began recording the staff on her phone, continuing to film the interaction. The airport's largest terminal handled the majority of daily traffic. Access doors leading from the concourse to the ramp were clearly marked for authorized personnel only and fitted with local alarm systems tied to security monitoring. Staff informed Susan that her bag had been misrouted and would arrive on the next inbound flight later that afternoon. They offered complimentary delivery to her home. She rejected the explanation, stating that she did not believe them. Convinced the airline was lying to her, she said she would go look for it herself and abruptly walked toward a marked service door reading, "Authorized personnel only. Alarm will sound." Without hesitation, she pushed through the bar. The alarm activated immediately, triggering both a local siren and an automatic notification to airport security dispatch. Although the door had experienced intermittent wiring faults earlier in the week, the alert was transmitted in real time, and a response unit was dispatched within seconds. Susan descended the exterior metal staircase and stepped onto the active ramp. The heat radiating from the pavement was intense, and the noise level was high. Jet engines idled in the distance. Several crew members noticed her immediately, radioed the breach to operations, and began shouting and signaling forcefully for her to stop and return to the building. Instead of stopping, she waved them off and continued forward, holding her phone out as if recording the scene. At the same time, a regional jet had just begun taxiing from a gate at approximately 10 miles per hour, following the painted taxi centerline. The cockpit crew observed a person entering the taxi path and immediately applied maximum braking. Although the aircraft was moving slowly, she entered the taxi path at close range, leaving insufficient stopping distance even after maximum braking was applied. Then the nose landing gear struck her. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and secured the area. She was transported to a local trauma center with severe lower body trauma, pelvic fractures, and significant internal bleeding. She underwent emergency surgery, but developed complications from traumatic shock and massive blood loss. Despite intensive care, she died 2 days later. The affected taxi lane and adjacent ramp area were closed for several hours pending investigation. This prompted a comprehensive review of ramp access procedures. The airport later reviewed its access protocols and reinforced staffing procedures at service doors during peak hours, emphasizing rapid physical response to any future unauthorized ramp entry. It was March 18, 2016. At a mid-sized gym in Tempe, Arizona, the evening crowd moved between racks as members filmed lifts with phones balanced on benches and bottles. Staff wiped chalk from barbells while workouts continued as usual, until a brief argument over a camera angle turned a loaded barbell into a disaster. After weeks of stalled progress, Tessa Rowe, 35, arrived straight from her shift at a dental office near campus. Her day had been spent answering insurance calls and managing appointment schedules. The gym was where she tried to prove something different about herself. She ran a small fitness page with about 4,000 followers. Her best confirmed squat was 255 pounds, but both her progress and attention online had slowed. That evening, she planned to film a heavier attempt at 275 pounds. The gym floor was crowded, yet she chose a rack beside the water fountain where lighting was brighter. She placed a tripod in the walkway in front of the rack despite earlier reminders from staff about keeping the path clear. She adjusted the camera several times and rechecked the plates to frame the shot. The rack's safety arms were set unusually low, leaving little margin if the bar shifted forward. At 7:42 p.m., she stepped under the bar and unracked the weight. As she descended into the squat, a teenage member walked behind the rack toward the fountain. His movement briefly crossed the edge of her camera frame. Tessa noticed it in the mirror. Instead of focusing on the lift, she rushed the ascent and pushed the bar back toward the rack. The bar struck the J-hooks with a loud metal crack. The right side settled correctly, but the left side landed slightly forward, resting on the lip rather than fully inside the hook. Tessa stepped away from the bar and immediately turned toward the teenager, pointing toward the walkway and complaining that people kept walking through her filming setup. Witnesses later said she focused on the tripod and camera framing rather than the bar behind her. The teenager apologized and stepped aside, but she continued arguing for several seconds about people crossing through the shot. Without checking the bar, she stepped back under it to recenter the bar before attempting the lift. As she lifted it from the rack, the left sleeve slipped off the lip of the hook first, twisting the bar sharply across her shoulders. Instead of dumping the bar backward, a common escape during a failed squat, she stepped forward in an attempt to stabilize it. The tripod stood directly in front of the rack, and witnesses later said she appeared to be trying to avoid dropping the bar onto the camera. As she tried to stabilize the weight, the uneven load rolled toward the base of her neck. Her chin tucked instinctively as the bar drove downward through her flexed cervical spine, and her knees folded beneath her. Witnesses heard the bar scrape and crash as she collapsed onto the safety arms. A member nearby called 911 at 7:44 p.m. Staff reached her within about a minute, removed the plates, and lifted the bar clear before starting CPR. Paramedics arrived about 6 minutes later, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later found a fracture dislocation between the second and third cervical vertebrae, with a complete spinal cord tear caused by the bar's downward force. Her death was ruled an accidental blunt force injury during weightlifting. Security footage and her phone recording showed the bar's left side resting improperly in the rack for nearly 20 seconds before she stepped back under it for the second attempt. After the incident, the gym replaced worn J-hooks and tightened rules on tripods and filming equipment near active racks. It was October 23, 2019, in the hills outside Santa Rosa, California, during the peak of wildfire season. Red flag warnings were in effect across the region due to extreme winds and critically low humidity. Emergency alerts warned residents that conditions could allow a small fire to spread uncontrollably within minutes. Margaret Sullivan was 51 years old and worked as a freelance bookkeeper from her hillside home. She had lived on the property for over a decade and frequently told neighbors that her experience made her better informed than emergency officials. She believed wildfires were exaggerated by authorities and often claimed that most evacuations were unnecessary panic responses. In online forums and neighborhood groups, Margaret repeatedly argued that wind forecasts were unreliable and that wildfire behavior was predictable if someone understood the terrain. Margaret also believed she had developed her own wildfire protection method. She told others that sealing doors, covering vents, and maintaining what she claimed was a controlled airflow environment inside the home could prevent smoke infiltration and heat buildup. She had reinforced her windows with reflective insulation and claimed the material would deflect radiant heat. These beliefs were not supported by fire science, but Margaret considered them proven through personal research and past survival during earlier fire seasons. When a mandatory evacuation order was issued that afternoon, emergency personnel began clearing the hillside neighborhoods. Responders went door to door advising residents to leave immediately. Margaret refused evacuation assistance and declined transportation offers. She stated that leaving would expose her home to looting and insisted that staying put was safer than evacuating into what she described as chaotic road conditions. As winds intensified throughout the afternoon, smoke became visible along the ridgeline. Ash began settling on nearby properties, and visibility dropped. Neighbors reported seeing Margaret moving items inside her home, rather than preparing to leave. Emergency responders documented multiple attempts to persuade her to evacuate, but she remained firm in her belief that her preparations were sufficient. By early evening, the fire advanced rapidly toward the neighborhood. Driven by gusts reaching severe speeds, responders were forced to withdraw as conditions became too dangerous. The last confirmed sighting of Margaret was shortly before emergency vehicles exited the area, with flames already visible above the ridgeline behind her property. Within minutes, the fire reached her home. Extreme winds carried embers ahead of the flame front, igniting dry vegetation surrounding the structure. The home was quickly overwhelmed. Fire crews were unable to return due to downed power lines, active explosions from nearby propane tanks, and zero visibility caused by smoke. Margaret's remains were located several days later during damage assessment operations. The medical examiner determined that she died from smoke inhalation and thermal injuries consistent with wildfire exposure. Her home was completely destroyed. Following the incident, the case was referenced in emergency response reviews as an example of how false confidence, unsupported beliefs, and refusal to evacuate can turn survivable situations into fatal outcomes. It was February 3, 2016, on a narrow residential access road in Phoenix, Arizona, where older homes backed onto a strip of cracked asphalt used by cars and motorcycles as a shortcut between two busier streets. The road carried steady evening traffic, and engine noise echoed between walls and fences as drivers passed through. Erin Voss was 33 and lived in one of the corner properties bordering the road. For months, she had complained about traffic noise, arguing that the road cut too close to her property line and was being used improperly. She believed the city had failed to enforce boundaries and that drivers were trespassing through what she considered part of her land. That evening, after another surge of cars and motorcycles passed through, Erin stepped into the roadway and began shouting at a driver who slowed near her driveway. She accused the driver of illegally using the road and claimed it was private property. The argument drew attention from nearby homes, and Erin raised her phone to record, positioning herself directly in the center of the lane to block traffic. The driver stopped several feet away and argued back through the open window, pointing out that the road was marked as public access. Erin refused to move and continued filming, pacing in front of the car and gesturing at the pavement. She insisted the noise was unbearable and said she had had enough, declaring that no vehicles would pass. As the confrontation continued, Erin lowered herself onto the asphalt, first sitting cross-legged, then lying flat on her back across the center of the road. She positioned her phone on her chest, still recording, and spread her arms slightly outward as if to force drivers to stop. The stopped car remained in place, its headlights angled slightly away due to the road's curve. At the same time, another vehicle approached from behind the curve at low speed. The road lighting was uneven, and Erin's dark clothing blended with the asphalt. The approaching driver did not see her body in the roadway until the headlight swept fully into the straightaway. The driver braked hard, but the distance was too short. The front bumper struck Erin's legs first, knocking her backward. The car rolled over her lower body and torso before coming to a stop several feet ahead. The impact forced the air from her lungs and pinned her briefly beneath the undercarriage. Neighbors ran toward the scene as the driver exited the vehicle in shock. Erin was unresponsive, with visible injuries to her legs and abdomen, and blood pooling beneath her. Emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found extensive blunt force trauma. Erin was transported to the hospital but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later reported massive internal injuries, including a crushed pelvis, ruptured organs, and severe internal bleeding, explaining that the force of the vehicle caused injuries incompatible with survival. The death was ruled accidental, resulting from blunt force trauma sustained after lying in an active roadway. Afterward, the city reviewed the road designation and installed additional signage and reflective markers. The incident was cited in neighborhood meetings as a warning about road rage escalation and the danger of blocking live traffic to prove a point. It was February 11, 2016. The morning heat in suburban Brisbane, Queensland, was already climbing past 82 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 o'clock. Tanya Rowe, a 39-year-old casual cleaner living in a weatherboard rental property on the city's western fringe, stood in her backyard staring at the wooden utility pole that serviced her block. Tanya worked irregular shifts cleaning offices and retail spaces across Brisbane. Friends described her as fiercely independent, but increasingly paranoid about corporations and government agencies. She spent hours each day on local community Facebook groups and neighborhood forums, posting lengthy complaints about utility bills and demanding immediate refunds. Tanya had a knack for escalating small disputes into public spectacles. She routinely tagged counselors in her posts, left scathing one-star reviews, and threatened media exposure if she wasn't placated. Her online behavior, frequent public shaming, blunt private messages to neighbors who disagreed, and recorded phone calls she posted as proof of harassment, had earned her a reputation around the block as the person who never let a grievance go. This distrust had hardened over years of financial struggles and mounting debts. Electrical service poles carry high-voltage distribution lines that step down power from the main grid to individual properties. Live service supplies in Australia are nominally 230 volts for single-phase service, and up to 415 volts across multiple phases, enough to cause instant cardiac arrest and severe burns upon contact. When a property's power is cut off, the meter usually stops electricity from flowing into the house, but the wires above can still be live unless the utility fully shuts off the service at the main network connection. That morning, Tanya told her neighbor she was going to fix the power herself. She borrowed a set of household tools, including pliers and screwdrivers, from another tenant in her building, and retrieved an old reflective safety vest she had found at a work site months earlier. The vest gave her an air of legitimacy, making witnesses assume she was an authorized contractor. She positioned an aluminum extension ladder against the pole around 11:30 in the morning. 3 neighbors saw Tanya climb the pole, wearing the reflective vest and carrying the tools in a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Tanya had no electrical training, no insulated gloves, no safety harness, and no understanding of what she was attempting. The ladder itself was metal, creating an additional conduction risk. Tanya reached the service connection point approximately 30 feet above ground around noon. The moment her tool contacted the live multi-phase service line, a massive electrical current surged through her body. Witnesses described a sharp metallic crack consistent with an electrical arc, heard by nearby residents. Tanya's body went rigid, locked in tetanic contraction as electricity overrode her nervous system. The arc flash damaged the tool and broke her contact with the conductor, and she separated from the pole. She fell 30 feet straight down, striking the compacted dirt and gravel beside the ladder. 2 neighbors sprinted across immediately, but found her unconscious with severe visible burns on her right hand and forearm. Paramedics arrived within minutes following a neighbor's call, but Tanya showed no pulse or respiratory activity. She was declared deceased at the scene. The coroner determined death resulted from electrocution causing immediate cardiac arrest, compounded by catastrophic blunt force trauma from the fall, including skull fracture and internal bleeding. Authorities charged no one but referred the case to workplace safety authorities as a warning example. Her funeral was held at a small chapel in Brisbane, attended mostly by neighbors and a few distant relatives. Her social media accounts were deactivated at her parents' request.
It was April 14th, 2016. The afternoon sun hung over a neighborhood dog park in South Austin, Texas, casting long shadows across the fenced enclosure where families gathered with their pets. Margaret Lee, 58, had no children of her own. Her family said that after her divorce 8 years earlier, she had channeled all her maternal instincts into Prince, whom she had raised from a puppy. Co-workers described her as defensive and confrontational, particularly when anyone questioned her dog handling practices. She had been cited twice by animal control for off-leash violations, but dismissed the warnings as overreach by bureaucrats who did not understand proper animal behavior. Friends said that Margaret frequently posted on social media groups for pit bull owners, defending the breed against what she called unfair stereotypes, while simultaneously documenting Prince's aggressive responses to perceived threats. That afternoon, the park was busier than usual. Several families with young children occupied the grassy area adjacent to the dog enclosure. A father in his early 30s had brought his 3-year-old daughter to watch the dogs from a safe distance. Margaret unleashed Prince immediately upon entering, ignoring the posted signs and verbal warnings from nearby dog owners. When approached by the father, who politely asked her to restrain her dog near the children, Margaret responded that Prince was perfectly trained and posed no danger to anyone. Prince initially appeared calm, sniffing the ground and exploring the perimeter. His body was rigid, a low rumble vibrating in his throat, and he moved forward without the typical sniff and turn most dogs show. Within minutes, the dog approached the toddler, who had wandered closer to the fence line. The father moved to block Prince's approach, and when the dog lunged at the child with bared teeth, showing stiff posture, forward ears, and raised hackles, the father instinctively kicked at the animal to protect his daughter. The kick struck Prince in the shoulder, causing the dog to yelp and temporarily retreat rather than escalating. Margaret witnessed this from across the park and ran toward the father, screaming that he had assaulted her dog. Witnesses reported that she shoved the man with both hands, nearly knocking him over. Before anyone could intervene, Margaret pulled a canister of pepper spray from her jacket pocket and aimed it at the father's face. A sudden shifting gust funneled the spray back into her face at point-blank range. The concentrated capsaicin caused immediate blindness and respiratory distress. She dropped the canister and clawed frantically at her burning eyes, her vision completely obscured. The spray left her disoriented, coughing, and functionally blind. Disoriented and panicking, she stumbled backward through the park gate, which someone had left open during the commotion. Margaret staggered blindly toward the street, her hands still covering her face. Multiple witnesses shouted warnings, but she could not orient herself. She reached the curb and stepped directly into the path of a city bus, traveling approximately 40 miles per hour on the adjacent road. The arterial road offered no crosswalk near the gate, and shrubs along the sidewalk partially obscured the driver's view. The driver had no time to brake. The impact threw Margaret's body nearly 25 feet. A bystander called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but Margaret had died on impact. The medical examiner's report documented multiple blunt force trauma injuries, including severe skull fractures and catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. The ME noted trace amounts of capsaicin in the ocular tissue consistent with recent exposure. Prince was impounded by animal control for a standard 10-day rabies observation, while the city initiated a dangerous dog review. Margaret's estate became the subject of potential civil claims following the incident, and the father later pursued charges related to the assault and pepper spray escalation.
It was October 3, 2015, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A permitted film crew had locked down part of a warehouse district to shoot a car rollover stunt. Off-duty police controlled traffic, and a clearly marked hot zone was set inside barricades and cones. Tammy Atkins, 31, was a substitute teacher in Albuquerque. A week of film-related road closures had forced long detours, making her late to 2 assignments and costing her a day's pay. She complained online that the production was treating the city as if it had priority over residents, and argued that the closures had not been properly communicated. Known among friends for confronting businesses over perceived rule violations, she convinced herself the production lacked proper authority. That afternoon, determined to expose what she believed was an unauthorized shutdown, she drove to the site with her phone ready to record. Orange water-filled barriers, traffic cones, and road closure signs marked the restricted block. The stunt corridor extended about 120 feet, with a coned safety buffer for the rollover arc. After 2 reduced-speed rehearsal passes, the coordinator initiated full lockup, halting all pedestrian and vehicle movement before the full-speed attempt. Around 2 p.m., Tammy approached a production assistant and demanded to know why she was being prevented from using the public street. As he began explaining the permitted closure, she interrupted and insisted on speaking with a supervisor. She began filming, stating loudly that taxpayer money was being wasted. An off-duty officer instructed her to remain behind the barricades. Tammy replied that she knew her rights and argued she could stand on any public sidewalk she chose. As final preparations began, the first assistant director initiated the final lockup procedure. Production assistants radioed in that traffic was halted at each control point. The stunt coordinator conducted a deliberate walkthrough of the vehicle path and the extended safety buffer. At that moment, the zone was visibly clear. Tammy stood outside the cones near the sidewalk, still recording. After the sweep, the coordinator returned to position and signaled that the set was secure. The stunt driver began the approach at the committed speed. As attention shifted downrange toward the oncoming vehicle, Tammy moved along the outer barricade line to improve her angle. Earlier in the afternoon, the temporary opening had been secured with interlocked steel barricades and weighted bases. However, Tammy slipped past during a brief moment when a PA was repositioning to confirm lockup at another post. Believing she was still outside the primary vehicle path, Tammy moved past the lighter barricade section and stepped just inside the clearly marked safety buffer, raising her phone higher. She crossed the boundary moments before the vehicle reached the ramp. According to investigators, the driver had already committed to the approach speed, making sudden braking unsafe. The driver hit the ramp at the designated speed and triggered the engineered rollover system. The vehicle flipped along its tested arc. As it rotated, the vehicle's rollover arc extended to the outer edge of the established safety buffer, where Tammy had positioned herself. She was struck and thrown to the pavement as the vehicle completed its roll and came to rest on its side several yards away. Crew members and the on-set medic reached her within seconds. Filming stopped immediately, and emergency procedures were initiated. She was unresponsive with severe head trauma and multiple fractures. She was transported by the staged ambulance within minutes to a nearby hospital. Imaging revealed a catastrophic traumatic brain injury. Emergency surgery was performed that evening to relieve intracranial pressure. She did not regain consciousness and died 2 days later from complications related to the injury. Investigators later determined that the temporary barricade opening had not been continuously secured during the stunt, creating an unauthorized breach in the safety perimeter. The production company was cited for failing to maintain barrier integrity during high-risk operations. Civil litigation followed and production was suspended. It was May 4, 2015. In El Nido, Palawan, the sea lay flat against the limestone cliffs as tourist boats drifted near the mouth of a coastal cave. From the outside, the water looked clear and shallow. Inside, the passage narrowed quickly, and natural light disappeared within a few feet. Vanessa Cruz, 34, had built a modest online following documenting her dive trips around Southeast Asia. She worked as a sales supervisor for an appliance distributor in Manila and spent most of her vacation days traveling to popular dive sites. Over the previous year, she had posted several videos criticizing what she described as overly restrictive dive rules, often arguing that many restrictions existed only to control tourists rather than protect them. Her experience was limited to recreational open water diving, with 42 logged dives. She had no cave certification or training for overhead environments, where divers cannot ascend directly to the surface in an emergency. That morning, a local guide briefed the group beside the cave, marking a turnaround point along the permanent guideline for recreational divers. Beyond it, the passage narrowed into a restriction used only by trained cave divers, where fine silt on the floor could quickly reduce visibility to near zero. Witnesses later said Vanessa repeatedly questioned the restriction during the briefing, arguing that the opening was clearly visible and insisting the warning sounded unnecessary. The guide explained again that the passage was unsafe without cave training and specialized equipment, but she continued pressing the point before the group entered the water shortly afterward. Divers later reported that Vanessa followed the main guideline at first. Visibility was already reduced to a few feet from sediment stirred up by earlier groups. When the team reached the marked boundary, the guide stopped and signaled that recreational divers should turn back. Instead, Vanessa hovered near a narrow side opening that angled upward through the limestone. Witnesses said she gestured toward the passage and moved closer, lingering near the restriction, even as the guide signaled again for her to stay on the main route. Moments later, she turned into the restriction. The opening narrowed immediately. Her fins contacted the bottom, lifting a dense cloud of silt. Within seconds, visibility dropped to zero. Divers waiting near the junction reported seeing the beam of her dive light disappear into the sediment. Inside the chimney, the passage tightened around her tank and shoulders. When she attempted to reposition, the tank valve struck the limestone behind her, preventing a full turn. Her dive computer, recovered later, recorded a sudden increase in breathing rate shortly after she left the guideline. Her tank gauge showed the air supply dropping rapidly over the next several minutes, consistent with heavy breathing under stress. Divers outside the restriction saw silt pushing from the opening, but could not see inside. The guide signaled her repeatedly with his light, but received no response. After several minutes, he escorted the remaining divers toward the entrance and alerted the boat crew that a diver was missing. Local rescue divers arrived and entered the cave along the primary guideline. With visibility near zero, they searched by touch along the rock walls. About 13 feet from the main guideline, rescuers found Vanessa wedged in a narrow vertical restriction. Her tank gauge showed almost no air. She was brought to the surface roughly 40 minutes after the alarm. CPR began on the boat and continued on shore, but she had no pulse. The coroner ruled she drowned after exhausting her air supply. Investigators found no equipment failure. The final report concluded she had left the guideline and entered the restricted passage without cave training, triggering a silt-out and disorientation that prevented her from finding her way back. In the months that followed, local dive operators reinforced the cave boundary markers and required stricter guide supervision for recreational groups entering the site.